when we listen for murmurs, what we want to do is determine whether they follow S1 or they follow S2. If they follow S1, systolic murmur. If they follow S2, that would be a diastolic murmur. In general, most murmurs caused by valvular heart disease are either due to valvular stenosis, where the valve doesn't open fully, or valvular regurgitation. Murmurs due to valvular stenosis occur during the phase of the cardiac cycle when the valve goes to open. Okay? Whereas murmurs due to valvular regurgitation occur during the phase of the cardiac cycle when the valve goes to close. It doesn't seal. So it leaks. Now, when you take physical assessment or physical diagnosis and you begin to listen to heart murmurs, you'll learn about the different qualities or characteristics of the murmur. Okay? So when you're listening to the heart murmur, you're not only trying to time the murmur during which phase of the cardiac cycle it's occurring, but then you're listening to the characteristics of the murmur. For instance, in aortic stenosis, where the aortic valve doesn't open fully, that's going to create a murmur. Is that going to be a systolic or a diastolic murmur? Systolic, because murmurs due to stenosis occur during the phase of the cardiac cycle when the valve opens, and the aortic valve opens during systole. So it's going to be a systolic murmur, not a diastolic murmur like the aortic regurgitation. But it's also going to have a different quality. Okay? Listen to how a murmur of aortic stenosis sounds. It's crescendo decrescendo, or diamond shape. Its intensity initially increases, and then it tails off. Okay. So you'd hear the first sound first, and then it would be followed rapidly by that systolic diastolic murmur, and then the S2. Whereas a murmur of aortic regurgitation is going to follow closure of the valve in diastole. So it'd be bump, bump. And it's going to be more of a blowing as opposed to a coarse murmur, and just decrescendo. When it starts strong, it gets weak and tails off. Okay. So you can tell by listening to the heart, by the timing of the murmur, systolic versus diastolic, and the quality of the murmur, and also where it's located over the proportium as to what's causing the murmur. Okay. Now, when the aortic valve closes here initially at the onset of diastole, the mitral valve is also closed. So this initial phase of diastole, during which both the aortic and the mitral valve are closed, is called isovolumetric relaxation. The ventricle's relaxing, its pressure is falling, but the pressure has not yet fallen below the pressure within the left atrium. So the mitral valve initially is still closed. Okay. Again, the initial phase of diastole is called isovolumetric relaxation. During this phase, the aortic valve has just closed, but the mitral valve is still closed as well. It is yet to open, as ventricular pressure is rapidly falling. Okay. Now, once the pressure within the left atrium reaches the point where it falls below that within the left atrium, what happens? The mitral valve is going to open right here. And now these two pressure tracings are going to become superimposed again. As the two chambers become one. Now, blood flow from the left atrium is going to enter into the left ventricle. And we're going to enter into the phase of diastole called ventricular filling. This is ventricular filling. And at the tail end of the diastole, again, we come up to that phase called the atrial systole. All right. Here's the EKG. This is the heart sounds here, S1 and S2. Okay. Notice that the onset of ventricular systole closely follows this spike-like complex in EKG called the QRS complex. This QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization. It represents the muscles of the ventricle receiving that action potential and depolarizing. That electrical event is going to be coupled to contraction. So the onset of systole closely follows the QRS complex. Notice that with the onset of systole, S1. Why? Because as the ventricle contracts, the AV valves close, and you hear that first sound. Following completion of systole, okay, as the pressure within the left ventricle begins to fall, aortic valve closes, so does pulmonic, you hear S2. Okay. Now, let's go backwards. Right before that QRS complex, we saw this other little deflection here on the EKG. That's a P wave. That represents electrical depolarization of the atria. So atrial depolarization is always going to precede ventricular depolarization because the electrical impulse is starting off in the SA node along the roof of the right atrium. So it's moving down. It's got to pass first through the atria before it even reaches the ventricles. Notice here that following the P wave depolarization of the atria, we have atrial contraction. Okay. Makes sense. All right. Let's come down here. This is ventricular volume. This is a plot of ventricular volume. And during diastole, we see the volume within the ventricle increasing, and then at the tail end, as a result of atrial systole, increasing a little bit more suddenly. Of course, much of that volume is going to be ejected into the aorta during systole. So during ventricular ejection, left ventricular volume quickly falls. Okay. Now, the volume in the left ventricle at the very tail end of diastole, right before systolic contraction, is called the left ventricular end diastolic volume, LVEDV. Okay? During systole, okay, some of this volume is ejected, such that by the time the aortic valve closes, we only have a little bit of blood present within the left ventricle. If we read this graph, we only have 70 cc's or 70 milliliters. That would be the left ventricular end systolic volume. Okay, so let's go back. The volume within the left ventricle at the end of diastole, makes sense? It's called the left ventricular end diastolic volume. The volume within the left ventricle at the end of systole would be called the left ventricular end systolic volume. And if we have a nice curve like this, we can actually measure it. The end diastolic volume is 130. The end systolic volume is 70. Now, that difference in volume between end diastolic and end systole is what's called the stroke volume. Okay? SV. This is the volume of blood that's been injected into the aorta. Okay, so stroke volume is end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. Makes sense. Okay? Coming down further, this shows the position of the semilunar and AV valves during each phase of the cycle. But when you first look at this graph, this chart here, it should make perfect sense. So much so that if you had to, you could recreate the drawing. Okay? So this is a very important drawing. You see it in lots of cardiology books. Okay, but it simply breaks down the cardiac cycle into smaller time intervals. And it gives you the pressures and the volumes, everything that's going on during the cycle. All right, does anybody have any questions? Anything's on copacetic? All right. So today, what we're going to do is dissect the heart.